So there's got to be some sort of joke about three colonialists getting on a podcast together. Um,
What a
I
lovely
don't.
start.
But three accents, everyone's going to be like, "Holy smokes, Robbie! You're getting accents constantly now. It can't be just be yours. You need to have." And I think both of your accents are better than mine. I think people are going to be like, "Oh man, Robbie, you need to start working on your British accent a little bit, right?"
You've
Have you
got the
got a British
you've got
accent,
the
Rob?
upper hand, though. You've got the upper hand because South Africa, of course, won the Rugby World Cup. So that's a bit of a trump card you can play.
Yeah, we certainly can. I lost a lot of years in my life watching the three rugby games, and I added a lot of gray hairs to the beard and to the scalp during that rugby game. Um, but yeah, what we're about to do here is what I think we've become known for. Is Blood Origin prides itself in the fact that we listen. We pride ourselves in the fact that we want to hear all sides of the picture. We don't believe, and you can hear me, I say this a lot, I don't think hunting is the panacea for wildlife conservation. I think it's a great tool in the toolbox. And so whenever controversial topics come up and people have strong opinions in controversial topics, we like to have those conversations. We like to hear from people. And what I want to do to start with, instead of just like jumping right in, because we all can, I want to just set the tone. I want to set the context here, and I want to introduce you guys. After our interactions through social media, I've gotten to know both of you through a little bit of stalking. I apologize, Google stalking and Instagram stalking, but you probably did the same for me and Blood Origins. And I'm a big fan of both of you. And I hope that after this podcast, we can stay in touch and we can continue conversations and we can continue distributing information back and forth. So let me start with you, Charlie, because you actually started this all off. And then I saw Will's post, and then I did the same thing with Will. But Charlie Weems Dunn, welcome to the Blood Origins podcast.
Thank you so much, Robbie. Happy to be here.
Charlie, where are you in the world? You don't sound like you're American, but you are in America.
I am indeed. Yes. No. I'm British. I grew up in London, but I've been living in the United States for the better part of a decade, or more than a decade now, a couple of decades.
Same here. When did you arrive?
I arrived for college in 2008, 2007, 2008. So it's been a while. Been a while in the US.
Yeah, I arrived in 2003 to do a PhD in Mississippi.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah. One of the states.
Charlie, what do you do as a living?
So I am the essentially the head of a private wildlife conservation foundation that we run, and our focus is essentially on landscape preservation. We focus on stemming the tide of biodiversity loss and habitat loss, primarily in Africa, with a deep focus on making these landscapes work for both the wildlife, but also critically the local communities in these areas. So providing them with viable, sustainable economies, while also protecting the critical environment that these areas still hold. And Africa is incredibly fortunate to have so much of an amazing landscapes and habitats that are still intact. Having said that, there's definitely a lot of pressure on these landscapes, and it's continuing to increase. And so our foundation is focused on ensuring that protection that works for both the landscape and also for the people that live in these landscapes is met. And we support organizations that focus on that.
Are you operating throughout Africa, or you specifically target a certain country? And are you executing grants to organizations that then implement the work?
That's correct. So we do operate throughout Africa. The size of the organizations we support varies. So it varies from ones that are a little larger but not massive, that focus Africa wide, and those that are more regionalized and focus on a specific country, and specific activities within that country. But all are primarily community focused. All are very high impact organizations that work in a very transparent and really very efficient manner without massive bureaucracies, which is very effective for getting money to the source, for both conservation activities but also community activities. And we give grants to organizations. Yeah. So in the future, there may be potential for us to have more of a cooperative engagement, but we very much understand that we are not the experts. We might know a bit about conservation from our years working as a foundation, but ultimately the real experts are those who are on the ground doing the operations, who have the requisite experience, have the knowledge, are the locals. And so we rely on them, of course, for a lot of what goes on and what we support.
Did you start the foundation, Charlie, or are you just now running the foundation?
I started the foundation.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Will Fortescue, did I get Fortescue right?
You did, Robbie.
Fantastic. You're not in America. You are still in the homeland.
I'm still in the homeland. Yeah, I'm sticking it out. Who knows if that'll change? Yes, I'm based up in North London, and have been for a while now, actually. But my background, probably a bit more simplistic than Charlie's. I'm just a straight up wildlife photographer. I also run a small.
No. You're not just a straight up wildlife photographer. Everyone needs to stop the podcast right now and Google Will Fortescue, because holy smokes, dude! Like your images have blown me away. Like that, it's crazy. You've got a book out, right, that has a compilation of all your photos.
I do indeed. Yeah, we brought that out just over a year ago now, which is it's about 110 photos from probably 3 or 4 years worth of work, all focused predominantly around East Africa, which has kind of been my my home and where I kind of trained as a photographer and as a photo guide. But we now have started kind of moving up into, we do a bit of work in the Arctic with our safari company. We've just started doing a bit of stuff in Asia as well. And trying to look for stuff that's a little bit different. We're not trying to just do the kind of the classic Amboseli, Masai Mara stuff, as popular as it is. We're trying to do, we're looking at places like Mongolia and trying to get a little bit more out there and offer something a bit different.
So do you offer people to go, do you take people on photographic safaris? Is that a part of the business model?
Yeah, very much so. So we're seeing it get more and more popular. We actually started up mid-pandemic. We thought the best company to start in a wealth of travel bans was a travel company.
Well, we started a non-profit in the belly of a pandemic, so.
Yeah, but there's logic in that, in that people are at home, and those that were able to, there was kind of people were saving a little bit of cash, not going out as much. So there was a bit more kind of generosity flying around. What people weren't doing was getting on airplanes.
Right.
But we kind of started it and kept it pretty low key for a while, but kind of put all the building blocks in sort of 2020, 2021, and starting to reap the rewards of that now. But no, so we're kind of 3 years into it now. What we primarily focus on is taking group trips. So we'll take anything up to 6 or 10 tourists in one go, and we will go, we either charter yachts up in the Arctic and go looking for polar bears, or it's, we've just come back from a trip in Zambia. My business partner's currently in India looking for tigers. So half of what we do is very keen amateur photographers. They come along with their gear and they want to improve as photographers. And then the other half of what we do is we kind of operate as a more traditional bespoke booking company as well. So people will come to us and go, either I want to go to Kenya, or I want to go to Tanzania, or I want to see elephants, I want to see leopards, and whatever it is they want to see. And we kind of pair up the trip with the person.
Amazing. Yeah, dude, India is just a crazy place. I'm in a couple of WhatsApp groups on human wildlife conflict in India, and the videos that I get sent are just like mind boggling.
So that's probably a podcast in itself, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure. And the other thing is I had this, again, it's all, this world lives on perceptions. 9/10 of reality is perception. And I said to my contact in India, I was like, man, I'd love to come to India and potentially see a tiger. Like that's, super rare. He was like, no, you'd be unlucky not to see two. I was like, what? He's like, yeah, they are. It's just, again, if you don't know the system, you don't know what's going on.
It's a success
India's
story.
fascinating. It is a success story, 100%.
It's because a national symbol, and they've done a very good job in India of bringing back tigers from low numbers. And of course, they've got better at counting as well, the censuses. But they've done a very good job because it's so wrapped up in pride of the country. But as you say, I mean, human wildlife conflict is quite severe, and they manage it quite well given all of the complexities in India. And I know they do a good job there. So it's interesting to see, but it's got some, like everywhere nowadays, it's got a lot of things on its plate.
Well, a booming human population next to a wildlife population that's also doing very, very well. It's almost like inevitable that you're going to have conflict, right? And Africa, unfortunately, is what's knocking on everyone on the doorstep, essentially, right? 2.5 billion people in Africa predicted to be, I don't know, what's the number? 5 billion by 2050, 6 billion, something crazy. And the pressure that's being put on habitats in Africa it's crazy.
Mm-hmm. It is, but I think that's what we're slightly here to talk about as well, is the kind of ways that are being put in to kind of protect that space. It's what Charlie's foundation does so well. And I know we're going to kind of dig into it a bit more, and we're all very keen to talk about it. And I know that, you've got your followers who'll kind of see one side, we've got some followers who'll see another. And then I think there's a huge kind of mid-ground at the moment that are still discerning the difference between legal hunting, illegal poaching, human wildlife conflict, and all of those things. And I think that is the conversation that I'm looking forward to having with you guys, is kind of where all of these very blurred lines cross over. And actually, I know that we're not on dissimilar pages for a lot of the conversation.
No, for sure. Yeah. So let me, I want to, again, all of this preamble is good conversation to set context, to make sure that everyone understands your position, where you sit. I think everyone knows where we sit, and I can reiterate it for everyone. So Charlie, I'm going to ask a simple question to both of you, but I know the answer, but I'm just setting the tone. Would you consider yourselves anti-hunting? I'll just leave it at that. Would you guys consider yourselves anti-hunters?
I suppose I'll go first. I have a real problem with the binary, in a more broader sense, the binary way that life has become, in that people are being put into boxes, and there's tribal identities assigned to a number of different sort of sectors of society. And I think that's not at all a good thing. I think, in general, I think people can and should have nuanced views on all manner of topics. And so I'd answer your question with saying that I'm neither a pro-hunting person or an anti-hunting person. I think I personally take a very pragmatic view with regard to these things, because we've had enough conversations with people to understand that ethical hunting has a very important role in protecting landscapes in Africa. I mean, I can only talk about Africa because that's what I know from our work. And so to say that I'm anti is not true because of that. And I'm aware of that. And there are plenty of places that there is no infrastructure set up as of yet to support either ecotourism, tourism, or other vehicles, conservation vehicles in certain areas, even though that may happen at some point. And there are many areas that are coming out of periods where the only reason why those areas are still wild is because of support from being a hunting concession. Otherwise, they could well have been turned over into development. They could have been developed and no longer be wild or wilderness areas. So my answer is obviously we're a conservation foundation, so we always have to look for, our ultimate goal is to ensure the preservation and protection of as much wilderness as we can. Species, if given space to roam, will always be able to regenerate. It's the beauty of life. If landscapes are preserved, species within those landscapes will proliferate. Losing the land is the biggest
100%.
worry that we have as a foundation, that I focus on, that we support groups that try and stop that. And so from our perspective, that is sacrosanct. And so there has to be a level of pragmatism when it comes to how you protect this land. Mm-hmm. Even though personally I might have views on, I'm not a hunter. I don't hunt. Having said that, I can understand the people that do hunt ethically, and I can understand the draw for it, and I can also understand that there are benefits in conservation for hunting concessions. Yeah. So that would be my view. What I am anti, and I suppose I should say, why are we having this conversation? I think there is a level of, there is blurred, as you said, there are blurred lines. Unethical behavior is always going to be an interesting one because it's a difficult one to police. It's one of those things that essentially you could say that there could be unethical behavior in any single thing. There's unethical behavior in tourism as well. So, but I think, so there has to be, I'm always anti-unethical behavior, and unethical and unregulated methods of doing anything, and hunting being one of those.
Mm-hmm. Very well said.
Anti.
Yeah, very well said. Will, I don't think you're very far from that, right?
No, I'm not, to be honest, and I can't say it much better than Charlie. I'm sure some people would love to hear me come on and go, I'm violently against it. But I'm on the same page as Charlie in that I wish it wasn't a case of having to be universally for or against it. It is a position we find ourselves in too often now. And, we've all put different posts up recently on Instagram talking about this, like the specific scenario we're going to come on to of these two super tuskers. And then kind of the feedback and the comments I've had on it have stretched all the way from give the animals the guns and let them go at the hunters through to boycott Tanzania. One thing I'm also conscious of, and your joke slightly touched on it at the start, is that I am British, and it's of no, my opinion is of no concern to Tanzania how they manage their natural resources. But at the same time, I think there needs to be an admission that these animals are icons. There are very few of them left. And actually it is of global interest what happens to these animals. And so that's why I do feel like we do have a reason to kind of come on and talk to you today. But no, I would love that. If I'm brutally honest, I would love a world to exist where we didn't need to potentially utilize hunting as a quote conservation tool, in my real heart. But at the same time, we are talking about a continent that is absolutely vast. What is the right answer in Amboseli in southern Kenya is not the same as the answer in northern Tanzania. And I think that's the big clash here, is that while I'm probably still working out exactly how I feel about it all, there is not unless you're a certain kind of person, I don't think you can be completely pro or completely against. I think most of us understand that there is a serious mid-ground in such a kind of heated topic.
Yeah, the way that I couch it is this: all three of us are pro wildlife conservation.
Yeah, for sure.
And at the end of the day, there's various tools to meet that goal. I did a podcast with. So the Zimbabwe Professional Guides Association is essentially that. It's hunters and guides that occupy the same, they do the same licensing, they do everything the same. And I had both a consumptive and a non-consumptive guide on there, a PH, a professional hunter, and then a professional guide. And the professional hunter said there shouldn't be it should be nuanced, to your point, Charlie, and it's not black and white. Consumptive and non-consumptive tourism is done in the right way, done responsibly, done in a regulated fashion, done ethically, are all striving towards the same purpose, which is conserving wildlife, sustaining habitats, and ensuring that those things are around for my kids, my grandkids, not Charlie's kids, but you know what I'm saying, in the future. And
And
that's
the local communities benefit around these areas, because otherwise
100%.
this wildlife and this land has no future, because people will not see a benefit in it.
100%. Totally get it. Um, so the topic that brought us all together were the two elephants. Not many details. I don't have any details on the elephants themselves. We just know that two big elephants got shot on the border in Tanzania in a wildlife management area called, I think it's called Etumet or something. I don't know if I'm saying it correctly or not. That borders right up against the Kenyan border and is, 50 to 100 kilometers. Is that right? You guys know it better than I do, from Amboseli.
It's not far at all. No, I mean, you're talking about it. It is literally across the border. So it's really not far at all. So again, no one knows apart from the guys that were there, kind of who these elephants were. There was no evidence left behind to kind of identify them. But I would have thought with pretty clear certainty they've probably kind of straddled the border, these elephants, between Kenya, where hunting is not legal, and Tanzania.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so obviously a lot of emotion, a lot of vitriol, a lot of on both sides of the coin around this topic. And so we were in some comments back and forth on Instagram, and as we've done before, as we did last year on the big tusker that got killed out of Botswana, I wanted to have conversations with people that around this topic, both that actually this time around we're not actually talking to anyone from a pro hunting perspective. We're just talking to you guys, and we did a podcast with a head warden out of Baluli, out of Kruger National Park, to talk about elephants and communities and stuff like that as well.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'd be very interested. I mean, I can't imagine that there would be many serious hunters that would be able to defend this particular instance. And I think this is what brought me to the table of the commentary on this post, this incident, because reports are that one of the elephants was, and again, the veracity of reports is something I can't, right. I don't think anyone is 100% certain of, but there are reports that one of the elephants in one instance was chased into the hunting area by a helicopter, which is not very sporting.
No, of course not. I think every hunter in that regard would say absolutely, what the hell's going on?
Absolutely. And then the carcasses of both elephants were subsequently burnt, which is also something that is very troublesome, because I know that one of the major hunting arguments is that when you hunt a species, especially a large species, one of the big benefits to the community of that hunt is the meat from the animal. And so if one of these animals has been essentially baited into the area or pushed into the area, and then both animals' carcasses were burnt, there's no way that this is an ethical hunt. This seems extraordinarily unethical. And I think that's where I had a problem. And I think it raises questions about how do you police accountability in a consumptive and competitive industry. And actually, I'm not just talking about hunting there. When I talk about consumptive and competitive, you could also say tourism is the same.
100%.
How do you police good wildlife and good wildlife management and ethical practices there? And there have been very obvious examples of where that has been a problem. So I think that's where I come to the table and I say, this seems like a very, very bad example. And in many ways, I would expect, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I would expect many hunters would be looking at this and saying, this is not good for us and for our sport. So what's going on here?
So the helicopter, I would totally agree. The problem is we have an if to it, right? We don't know. We have one article written by Africa Geographic saying that it was chased in Nobody's seen footage. Nobody's seen anything. So we're almost, everyone's at a stalemate there because I can't say it didn't happen. Nobody can prove that it actually happened. But I will say this to your point: if it was true, that's unacceptable, right? From an ethical perspective. Interestingly enough, when I saw the burning of the carcasses, I was also just like, oh my God, this is not good. It's not good. But when I researched it more and I talked to more people operating that area, there's a distinct reason why they burnt them. And here's the reason. Because this is northern Maasai land, the Maasai people do not eat elephant. So they can't donate the meat. They can't give the meat away. Also, the Maasai people are cattle people. And so, again, here's a big if. I'm not saying it would have happened, but here's a big if. Those carcasses would attract predators, lions, leopards, hyenas, and be a perfect opportunity to poison the carcass to get rid of those predators in that community land, because that Etzimit Wildlife Management is a community block.
It raises
it's
that
interesting.
raises an interesting question, but then the question you have to ask, and I'm not saying that I know the answer to this question, is in that case, is hunting in that particular area a good conservation practice? Because it seems like if you remove that big benefit and you even create some potential externalities in it, could create community conflict even, then it seems like even more of a sort of shaky question of whether trophy hunting should be taking place in that particular region.
Yeah, it is a good question. I asked a guy who works on the sort of regulatory policy side of things what he knew about this area. And what he said was this community, this Etimit community, actually is one of the biggest, how did he couch it? Like highest grossing communities when it comes to revenue being generated in that community from hunting across Tanzania, because it's a community block. Now, would something else replace it in that block because of the closeness to Amboseli? I don't know. But hunting seems to be doing very, very well for that community specifically in terms of revenue and whatnot. Now, granted, would it be a better use of the animal if the meat could be donated? 100%. And that happens, in vast majority of the rest of Africa. Just the imagery of the elephants being burnt is not a good image, but there's a reason for it, unfortunately.
Yeah, the reason's shaky though, and the reason might not have particularly good foundations, especially when as you say, I mean, land use there is something that, and a good example, and this is quite a contentious example, but there was fairly successful conservation tourism that was occurring in a part of Tanzania called Loliondo that was then acquired for a hunting concession. And I don't want to get into that because it does have a lot of very deep.
Sure.
And again, as Will stated, and I'm very much on the same page here. Far from me, with the minimal experience I have, to question and state what Tanzania should do about its land and its area. That is ultimately for Tanzanians to decide in their country. But it does raise this issue. I mean, I understand in many parts of Africa, especially parts of Africa where there has been prior conflict and conservation for many years was difficult, but not so much conservation, but tourism for many years was simply not there because of conflict. And as a result, there was a reliance, and there still is in many areas, especially in southern Africa, a reliance on hunting as a way to keep some of those landscapes that for many years were closed off due to civil wars, due to conflicts. But I think this particular example is quite a tricky one in terms of justification.
Well, tell me a little bit about Amboseli itself from a photographics perspective. And I know that there are some big elephants walking around and whatnot. Do people say, hey, I want to go see X elephant Why elephant? Or is it just a matter of when you go there, there's a good chance, a greater chance of you coming across from a photographic perspective to these big tuskers?
Yeah, so I mean, there's two sides of that, and it kind of loops back to what we've just been talking about. So yeah, firstly, yes. So we get guests and clients all the time that will go, I would like to see and photograph Craig, for instance. So they will pack their bags and come to Kenya purely to see Craig. He's probably the poster boy now for Super Tuskers. It used to be Tim, until a few years ago. Now it's Craig. No offense to Craig's, but the naming committee on these things sometimes needs to be addressed. You see these beautiful Super Tuskers, and sometimes the names are not always what you would naturally assume. There's been Ulysses and Tolstoy's as well, which feels a lot more appropriate, but very much so. And these photographers, on the whole, they do not mind the weather, they don't mind the scenery. Amboseli itself, and I don't want to upset too many, but it is not the most beautiful place to go on safari. If I was picking
How
a
long
place,
have you been in Amboseli, Will?
I've been going there probably 2 times a year, 3 times a year for the last 3 or 4 years now.
Okay.
So I used to
Have
live
you
out
seen changes in Amboseli over that time?
So I'm predominantly going there at kind of the peak of the dry season. And the reason for that is, so Amboseli is famous. It's got the Amboseli lake bed. And as we hit kind of peak dry season, these elephants are coming across these lake bed morning and evening, coming into the park to get water and then leaving the park in the evening. And so you can wait out on this lake bed, you can lie under the car, you can get these amazing kind of low angle shots of these elephants. People love it. It's an awesome experience. And so when I'm there, you are hitting kind of, so between July and October, you're getting kind of single digits in terms of millimeters of rain. And so people there will freely admit that the big problem now is becoming where the Maasai can graze their cattle. And that has been the big notice in the last few years. The droughts there have been really severe, and you guys will know what a drought can do to a community. The last couple of years, there's been pretty staggering facts and figures coming out of the elephants and the cattle that have been dying in this drought, among other species. So we firstly, I first started going there as kind of COVID travel restrictions were easing off, so it was pretty empty, and it does now get busy. But I would say it's a kind of 2 or 3 day destination for most people. They kind of come in, they see it, they see Kili, they see these huge elephant herds. Sometimes, especially in the wet season, you can get herds of 110, 120 elephants walking across the plains. So we are very much getting people going there purely for photography, to photograph specific animals. And I would say with kind of relative certainty that if you took away these icons, if you took away your Craigs, your Tims, your Tolstoys, your Ulysses, then the area would be seriously affected in terms of the numbers of tourists going there.
So I don't know if you watched my video. I think you probably did on YouTube about this. I think one of the things that I want to point out, and I think it's important for people to realize, is that ecotourism and hunting work very, very, very well together. They work in harmony across a lot of places in Africa. I just did 16 days in Botswana last June, and it was unbelievable to see. There are places that hunting shouldn't happen in the Delta. And you're even seeing it in certain places like NG41 in Mababi. Have you been to Botswana, Charlie or Will?
Yeah, I have, yeah.
Okay, Will, I'm going to let you in on a secret. The next Masai Mara is a place called Mababi. Okay, so what's happened is through tectonic activity, one of the river courses, the Gwai, that never ran. It was a dust bowl back in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. The Mababi Depression has the Gwai River runs permanently through it, and then in the wet, it floods out this huge wetland ecosystem. It's probably has today one of the largest congregations of buffalo in Africa. You're talking about 3, 4, 5,000 in like the June, July timeframe. I think we were there in June. Herds of like 500 sesame. It's unbelievable. Massive lions. It's brilliant. And so what's happened is that NG41 used to be a complete hunting block. But the community has realized that, oh my God, we've got this thing now that is just unbelievable. And so the block has been split. The block has been split to say, here is a block that is ecotourism only, here's a block that's a mixed block, and then here's a hunting only block.
So it's like Cylinder. It seems like it's a very similar evolution to Cylinder, where the spillway ran again, and it's become again, a conservation block of a great renown.
Yeah, 100%. But the ecotourism value around Mababi is like 20 to 30 kilometers in. That's it, right? Once you get past that 20 kilometer radius, it's just literally raisin bush for 100 kilometers and the odd ostrich, steenbok, and then elephant after elephant after elephant after elephant, just hundreds of elephants. And I think in that scenario, and to come back, sort of bringing it full circle here, if that Mababi has a Tim, has a Craig, has a Tolstoy, and this happens in Africa already, a lot of people don't realize it, but they have a little agreement, and they say, hey, this animal right here, from an ecotourism perspective, is super, super valuable. It is not to be touched from a hunting perspective. And so there are harmonies here. That's not to say all elephants are off the table. It's just, here are these 3 or 4 that are big iconic elephants. And I think from a quota perspective, like Mababi, I don't think they get so granular in terms of how many elephants are in Mababi. But I think it's 20,000 or 25,000. There's only a quota of 5 elephants in Mababi. I don't know what the quota is in Etimit, but it's probably very, very, very small too.
Yeah. Different things work in different places. I mean, a similar type of paradigm exists in Mana Pools and its surrounding areas in Zimbabwe, where there are a number of fairly renowned elephants that aren't. It's a really interesting question, because then I've heard
Could you imagine we had asked the question before Cecil happened?
Well, again, and I know you're going to, I think I heard that you were going to speak to at some point on the podcast, Dr. Craig Packer, in which case, and he's a lion.
I'd love to get Packer on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, he knows far more about lions, so we can go into a little bit about lions. But I think with Mana, I've heard a number of things. I mean, I think that there has been an equilibrium that has existed so far, whereby some of these more renowned elephants that are known for, which is a unique behavior in Mana Pools, going up on their back legs and reaching for the albino pods. Yep. They, and they do so in the wet season. They do end up moving out of the core area of Mana Pools into some areas where hunting is allowed. And thus far, there has been a sort of paradigm of not hunting them. Having said that, I'm not entirely sure whether that's due to benevolence or whether it's because they have collars on, and as a result, tracking who did that would be, if one of them were to be killed, it would cause a massive outcry, which it doesn't really matter what the reason is. If people feel that way, that's good in some ways too, because they recognize that it would be damaging to do that for everyone, right? Even for people who are doing, for the hunting. I think I think that there is an example of that paradigm working. I think that it's what comes back to what Will said earlier. Each area seems to be very different. And I think enforcement is going to be something that is really a critical question here. Like, how do you enforce ethical laws around what can be hunted, what can't be hunted? How can you who's going to make the delineation as to value of a specific? I mean, we can all agree that, and there are very clear figures that show that the Amboseli population of super tuskers is extraordinarily valuable, as Will mentioned, for tourism in Amboseli. It's just a question of enforcement, of like ensuring that ethical standards remain, and ensure that they're also cross-country and cross-border.
Well, when you operate, I've always wanted to ask this question, so I apologize. You're the one that's going to get this question, but when you operate in Amboseli, is there a requirement by photographic operators to provide like a percentage of their revenues back to communities?
I think a lot of that depends on where you're staying and kind of who you're operating with. So, like the flat answer is no, but there are the majority of camps that you stay in. So we use a group called Elephant Garden. We've been going there. I've used the guide Eric ever since I've been going there. He was a private guide, just himself in his vehicle. He's now been able to open up his own camp. So he's actually annexed, it's about 420 acres now of private conservancy. And so for that reason, I've always used
Eric's
Eric.
an African, a Kenyan guy.
He's a Kenyan, yeah.
Local
Oleg
guy.
Kama, he's
Awesome.
a Maasai.
Awesome.
And he is the most phenomenal elephant guide that I've ever worked with. But when we go and stay there, then a percentage of our bed night is going back into the conservancy of the 420 acres that he has annexed. No, there is no set requirement. But at the same time, what we're doing, say we come in and we see Craig, for instance, when we leave, Craig's still walking around. So actually the revenue of us going in is going to be repeated over and over and over again to see the same elephant. So short answer, no, but I think there is more to it than that, in that, I don't know how hunters work and whether they're going to the same place over and over again, but we're taking people to see Craig 3, 4, 5 times a year. And so actually the constant repeat business, I think trumps having to kind of put a one-off donation in.
Yeah, there's thoughts around numbers and whatnot. Obviously, the costs of a hunter going in terms of the amount of money they're paying. Again, it's very different in different places. The only data that I have in terms of comparison is Namibia. In Namibia, it's a 1-to-77 ratio. So the amount of money that one hunter is bringing in is the same as 77 tourists hitting the ground in Namibia. Tanzania and Kenya may be different because of the costs associated with going to Amboseli, right? It's not cheap. And staying in Elephant Gardens probably isn't cheap either. What's a bed night in Elephant Gardens? 1,000 a night?
No. I mean, again, varies depending on season, but starting at probably 400 in low season, going up to the top end is probably 1,000 in high season. But on that, I agree as well. And there is bad practice, and we are obviously seeing, as certain areas become more and more popular, you look at the Mara, for instance, and the foot traffic there is hectic.
Jeez,
hectic. And on that, I do agree with you in terms of the facts kind of speak for themselves. So I wrote my dissertation, it was a while ago now, but I did write my dissertation on the effects of trophy hunting on African wildlife, like species population. And it was a key kind of consideration in the dissertation, was that you look at the kind of value of one hunter versus, like you say, 77 tourists having to come through, or $1 to $77. But it loops back to, what's right for one area isn't say right for another. You look at Kenya, they've banned hunting. I can't remember the exact. Do you know the exact date, Robbie?
1974.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a while, so we kind of got a 50-year scope to look at. And actually, their population numbers are, they are doing. Can't give it a kind of blanket on every species, but they are doing well. You can't put that down to banning hunting at all. But you look at the revenue generated in Kenya now from tourism, it's kind of second or third on its GDP contribution.
Yeah, I think Kenya has the number that obviously we use as hunters is like, hey, look at the terrible example that Kenya is. 70% of the wildlife has been lost.
Yeah.
However, when you look at, and that's true. That's true. But I'll say this, but when you look at today and the efforts that have happened since, like, the whole the poaching crisis that happened in 2010, 2011, 2012, that decimated Tanzanian elephants. Kenyan elephant populations are on the rise. I speak with, I don't know if I've spoken to actually 2 other Kenyan photographic guys on this podcast. One guy's name is Zarek Cocker, and then I spoke with Calvin Cotter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the efforts that are going into what you're doing, Charlie, what your foundation's doing in terms of like habitat and working with people to say, listen, wildlife's a lot more important and a lot more valuable to you versus you think you need to get rid of that impala because it's competing for grass with your goats. There's opportunities here. And that is certainly changing the landscape in Kenya. And yeah, everyone should be in favor of trying to increase habitats for wildlife. Um, I've got a couple of questions. Number one, I've never used the term super tusker. We just use 100-pounders. Is that what you're referring to in terms of your definition of super tuskers?
Yeah, very much. So I mean, I was interesting. I was listening to the other podcast you did as well with Andrew Dankwitz.
Oh yeah,
And yeah, I mean, I mean, I don't know what that is in kilos. It's about 45 kilos, isn't it? On either
I think
tusk,
so.
but
I think so.
along those lines. I think there was an argument it was done visually with tusks that scrape the ground, but actually you're finding you take an elephant like I think it was Tolstoy. They were having to dart him to actually shorten his tusks at points because they were getting stuck in the ground. But no, for
Crazy.
everything.
What are your thoughts there? Why would you? Is that not like? Isn't that crazy? Is that? I'm super interested. I have no opinion here. I'm like, the intervention of humans to an elephant to cut its tusks. Is it just merely because of the revenue generated because of that elephant?
I wouldn't know. I mean, I've sadly never got to see the elephant. He passed away a couple of years ago now, I believe. And again, it's slightly. I mean, I'm on the podcast to talk about how another country manages its natural resources, but I would imagine the decision was made. I don't know if it was purely financially, but for the elephant's health as well.
What do you think, Charlie?
Well, I think one of the things that needs to be discussed when we're talking about super tuskers, and I think two species come under this banner, and I think it's an interesting question. I don't have all the answers here, but I think it's an interesting question to talk about with hunters, is when you're talking about elephants and lions, I do think the impact on herd dynamics and pride dynamics needs to be discussed. Because whether or not you define a super tusker, let's just talk about elephants here, as a separate genetic trait. And we've seen, and both Will and I will say this, there's not a consensus here as to whether it's a genetic variant or whether it's just because they've got to a certain age and they've grown very large tusks. What we do know, though, is that unlike some herd species, elephants still possess an incredibly important role when they have reached an old age, male elephants. The wisdom of the herd, they're still reproductive, and their passing on of their seed is still a reality. And that's something that usually people will say, well, they've got to an age. I mean, you don't want to be killing breeding females and things like that, but these older males still have a very important function in an elephant herd. And with regards to the super tuskers specifically, they've made it to that age and they are passing on their seed. And so I think that is a very important trait. And with lions, when you talk about pride dynamics, there it's more of a case that these are carnivores. If you take out the biggest, most impressive male with a black mane, which an example you pointed out earlier on is the famous one, that actually has a lot of cascading impacts on lion prides in those areas, whereby lion prides take a while to reform. Sometimes they don't reform. There's conflict. Other lions are killed. Cubs are killed. When you take out a male lion, there's a cascading set of impacts that occur. And so I think the dynamics of those two species as it pertains to hunting is something that really does need to be discussed. I think is at the crux of why I feel like there's a bit of a need to sort of assess here, because it's not clear to me that you can say that they function in the same way as, say, a buffalo herd does when you cull a buffalo herd. There are major differences in some, and so it's not just a question also of saying, well, they're charismatic and everyone loves them. They're the most beautiful species. They're what everyone comes to see, even though that does have some truth to it. That has truth to it, especially from a tourism perspective. I do also think, though, that there are biological factors here that have to be hashed out.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you. I think that, looking at the science, I'm a scientist. I'm a restoration ecologist. So I love science. I let science and then let the science drive the pragmatism thereafter. So the science says, you're right. The Ambercelli work that Poole has done and Hollister has done, says that reproductive success in those herds, specifically in Ambercelli, increases through time. They increase the reproductive success, the older and older and older they get. And then there is a moderate decline in the last couple of years of life on the science in terms of that reproductive success. Doesn't mean that it's not still successful. It just means that there is a moderate decline. The genetic argument for tuskers may or may not be true. We don't know. That comes down to looking at it. But the only data set that I know of that correlates anything to do with tusk size and length and mass is the Ian White and Anthony Hall Martin data set out of Kruger National Park, which is the culling data set of 1,600 elephants that correlates mass and length with age. So I think we're all on the agreement that as old elephants get older and older and older, they get bigger and bigger tusks and longer tusks. Now, you throw in a genetic argument in that, then yes, there's the potential to have really big tusks with that sort of playing a role or sort of the correlation, not causation, but correlation between those elements. My standpoint here is, okay, if from a hunting perspective, if you're saying, okay, what elephants should we hunt? If hunting is something that we agree on, not three of us, but let's just say we agree we're going to hunt elephants writ large in this one area. Which elephants should we hunt? If you're going to take out 5 elephants, which elephants should you hunt? Well, somebody who pays for the elephant is going to want the largest elephant they possibly can get. Well, that means an old elephant. An old elephant, based on the data, suggests that they've had good reproductive opportunities since they've been breeding, hopefully since they've been 35. They're getting better and better and better and better and better at it. So hopefully you're taking out an elephant that is big tusked at the last years of its life, 51, 52, 53. And in that regard, you're putting as much genetic material back into the population. And yes, we're sacrificing however many years that elephant was left to live. That's an assumption. 1, 2, 3, 5, maybe. So from a hunting perspective, that's the argument. That you are trying to take the largest animals that just happen to be the oldest, but that have also had the most opportunity to put back the genetic material that have made them, if you believe in the genetic argument, have made them the big tuskers.
Yeah. I mean, I think, look, and I'll let Will go in a second as well. I think that I take what you're saying. I mean, I think we already answered it in some ways about 20 minutes ago when we talked about there needing to be an accountancy done on the benefits of certain populations of elephants to certain areas like Mana Pools and Ambercelli, where people are actually paying an extraordinarily high amount of money to see these elephants, and that is repeated again and again and again. And that's bringing in a lot to communities, especially now that, I mean, Will can talk much more about the sort of ecotourism side, but from the conservation side, when you have organizations that are doing community conservation in these areas we support, that are protecting these these animals and are also showing to local communities in these areas that this is something that you should take pride in, having this animal here with this massive tusk. It's a symbol of your community, protect it. And I think that's being done as a response to trying to really, it's actually from a rhino perspective, because it ensures that the community is your first line of defense against poachers. They see the rhino as something that's part of their community. And if anyone comes in and they look like they're outsiders who might be looking to poach the rhino, the community becomes your first line of defense. So that's where that argument comes from, and it's a strong one. So I think there needs to be regulations, and then you get to the question of like, well, are these regulations going to be followed in an inherently in a business that's competitive, where you're inherently wanting to get the best, the biggest, the best, the most impressive? That's a tricky question to answer. And I think this obviously focuses on elephants, but with lions, it's even more difficult because then you want to take the biggest, the most impressive, but then that does, because they're carnivores, create cascading impacts on the prize. Most famously in and around Wangi. And I've had the privilege of being to Wangi and spending time with prides there. And Cecil's pride took many, many, many years to actually recover from that. And they lost many cubs during this process. They've still, the lion dynamics are there, are ever changing until a dominant set of coalition of males or male takes over. And so you then get to that tricky question of, I mean, I see where you're coming from, but there's lots of issues, and then enforcement's one of them. I mean, Wangi was a situation where also there was a similar accusation of what was happening in Endomet, which is that people were actually baiting these lions across the train line into the hunting concession from Wangi, which again is very unethical. So how do you police that unethical behavior so that theoretical paradigm of taking the correct elephant or the correct, species is actually followed? It seems like in reality it's quite difficult, and so then you get to questions of like, is this the correct form of use of this land for communities as well as for the people, and the communities are really what matters in these areas. It's the money coming into those areas. Is it the correct use for them?
Well,
yeah, I think so. Specifically to go back to what you were saying about, okay, so you're looking at what elephants could be hunted, and you're saying, right, so elephant gets to say 52, 53, it's kind of had that chance to pass on the genetics. We all know elephants, their tusks grow more in the last 10 years than they will in the previous 30, 40. So these guys are growing more and more as they get older. If we compare, say, Craig and Amboseli to these two that have been shot in Tanzania, so we know there that for whatever reason the carcasses were burnt, so that the meat side of it is irrelevant. So it's a purely kind of financial benefit, this hunt. If you look at Craig, for instance, and you applied that logic and go, well, Craig's now probably 51, 52, so you might say he's kind of in an age range where he might be considered one of the ones to shoot. We could say, okay, he's had his chance, he's passed on his genes to X, Y, and Z. He's now kind of game to be hunted. Because of what he's become in the last 3 or 4 years, his real value to the community has boomed in the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, I probably spent personally between $30,000 and $40,000 kind of photograph in the last 4 years. We've had equal of that from clients, and that's just for us. So you then think about how much it's bringing in 365 days a year compared to the hunting permit. And I know we then get back into that ground of, okay, well, it's the bigger carbon footprint, it's the bigger human footprint. But you look at the value Craig is having to that community now in the kind of twilight of his life, it is massive compared to what it would have been 10 years ago. So it then gets us into that kind of really hazy ground of, okay, well, if we're trying to, obviously the three of us are not going to reach a conclusion about what the right thing to do for hunting is across all of Africa in an hour and 20 minutes on a podcast. But if we're trying to then
why not?
put in
Will,
place,
come on.
Sorry, I'll dream big. But if we're trying to find some kind of sustainable solution here and go, okay, so what makes one elephant acceptable to hunt and what makes one not? Because first there's a whole moral conversation there. But you've then got to start looking at things like, okay, well, if we take that guy, say you put a cutoff and you go, okay, you can only shoot an 80-pounder or a 70-pounder. Now, if a hunter, be it guest or the hunter themselves, is a true conservationist and they know the reason for that is we have to leave these bigger guys, then they should go, fine, I get the argument for that. I'm a conservationist, therefore I stick by those rules. But where do we start to draw a line and go, well, these elephants are fair for hunters, these ones are not? And kind of going back to your point, Robbie, if we go, okay, well, we know that these ones can be hunted and these ones can't, would you hand on heart say that you would expect the industry to abide by that? Would you not say there's the odd bad apple that would take the chance and that would go for something that's been marked as off the cards? I would not speak for the whole photographic industry and say I know that they all act in a way they should act around these super tuskers. In the same way that I don't know if you would feel comfortable saying while you 100% would put these rules in place and you would follow them, do you honestly believe that the whole industry would do the same thing?
Yeah, I think to your point, I think there's bad apples in every industry, right? And there's bad apples in ecotourism, and they do things that they shouldn't be doing. And unfortunately, we have the same thing. Not saying that occurred in this scenario, because again, we don't know the ifs around the
No,
helicopter.
and nor am I, just to be
Yeah,
clear.
100%, 100%. I think the critical point here is, and I think one of the criticisms, Charlie, and I'd like Will's response here, the criticism from the money perspective that I've heard around Amboseli is that, yes, it's generating a lot of money, but how much is actually reaching the community versus not?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I would put the same to, the hunting industry as well. It's the same in both industries. You have the good eggs and you have bad eggs.
Yeah.
You can stay at lodges that don't, put their 10 cents back in, and you can stay at lodges that go above and beyond. It's kind of down to you as an operator going into that area to go, well, okay, these are the people that I want to work with. You look at, so what you've got is you've got Amboseli, and then you've got all the adjoining conservancies, and then you've got wildlife corridors that take it over to kind of the Kamana Sanctuary and the Chulu Hills. And actually in that area, you have an enormous human population. And it's, as we kind of touched on earlier, it is booming, massively. And so you are seeing an increase in human wildlife conflict. And you've got groups like Big Life, you've got groups like the Amboseli Trust down there doing everything they can. But ultimately, we know we are in a sad situation where it's slightly becoming a what pays stays. And so there are community members that will go, I'm sorry, this is an elephant. It comes through the fence, tramples my crops, eats my livelihood. It's of no monetary value to me. But you're also getting guys like we use a Maasai tracker called David. He's now pretty much out 24/7 every day. He's used by other lodges and other camps to find his elephants. There is that kind of, I'd love to be able to sit here and tell you the exact figures of how much money is going back into but I can't. We're in a land where people can take their chance and go, well, I'm going to put a lodge there and I'll just rake in the fact there's elephants around. We make a real effort with our guests. So the Amboseli Trust, they have their headquarters in the middle of the park. We took some guests there on our last trip. The trust really opened their doors for us. They've got an amazing monitoring team there. We learned all about that setup, and the guys straight away were like, okay, well, I'll put my hand in my pocket, I'll donate to you guys. I appreciate that's the conservation side, that's not the community side. And it's sexier, let's be honest, to donate to the conservation side than it is to go into the community side of it. But again, it just comes down to the operator and their willingness to go, okay, well, I want to stay at the places that are doing this. And I'd love to be able to say everyone does that, but the fact is they don't.
Yeah, well said, Will. Charlie?
I can't talk so much to the tourism side of the ledger, since I don't have as much of an insight as Will does to tourism operators. I'm going to have my own personal experience, but that's just lived experience. From the conservation side of things, though, I think one of the things that has been happening, and it's been increasing, is the donation from, or the percentage given from, tourism ventures and camps to organizations whenever they visit areas that money is going into community conservation initiatives. Now, I would love more to go in. I'd like a higher percentage, would be great from many tourism operators to go to organizations who are doing fantastic community work in all of the areas of Africa that we focus on. Obviously, Will mentioned Big Life in Amboseli and Amboseli Trust, and those are great organizations that they do receive certain amounts of money from tourism. I do think, though, that from conservation perspective, it's still a model that's highly reliant on donors and donations. That's essentially what brings in the vast majority of its funding. And I can just speak from that respect, saying that I think that in those instances, the money that is coming in is increasingly very good in that it is going towards communities, because there are so many very community-orientated conservation outfits now operating in Africa that are not your grandfather's conservation outfits that essentially weren't providing very much at all to
Right.
communities, but now
Yeah.
are actually at the tip of helping communities, and not just doing token things either that will help them for a small period of time, but actually building sustainable economies, allowing a certain amount of in buffer zones, a certain amount of things like fishing and things that help communities, but also show them the value of the core areas for wildlife and preservation of these species. And in terms of the species themselves, the community seeing value in the protection of these species is something that's very important. And I think that ultimately the battle in many ways is against poaching, and it's ultimately against loss of land. And I think that's how I see it. I do think, though, in this particular region, the Amboseli Savo ecosystem, the symbols of that area are indeed the super tuskers, like the symbols of Rwanda's conservation effort are mountain gorillas. And so I think that it is inherently wrapped up in whether that paradigm can continue with conservation, having the funds to then protect the area and the land and benefit the communities, in many ways rests on the continuation of these species and the continued viewing of these species. I think a lot of conservation outfits, and I know this from being deep into it, they connect to people who maybe aren't very knowledgeable about conservation by showing species, making them very species orientated, when in reality what they're doing is they're protecting the landscape and the biodiversity and the community and benefiting the communities. But I do think as ambassadors for that conservation, charismatic species such as the big tusker, the tuskers of Amboseli, the mountain gorillas of Rwanda, the lions in a number of areas across Africa are sort of the benchmark in terms of allowing money to flow in. And I think that's really an important thing for conservation.
Yeah, look, I think all of the things that we've said, though we may not be on the same page when it comes to like the exact elephants to be hunted or whether elephants should be hunted, period. I think we are all on the same page in that we know there are massive challenges in front of us when it comes to wildlife around the world, conservation of wildlife around the world. And to your point, Charlie, I think the key core piece of having sustained wildlife is to have habitat available and protected for it to be able to do what it's supposed to do, maximize its biodiversity in those habitats. We have a booming human population that is expressing a bunch of pressure on those habitats and that wildlife. And to your point, Will, it is imperative that the community feels like they are benefiting from the wildlife that are around them in such a way that they value it staying around for the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think our differences are ones that come about with, regardless of personal preferences, whether, we like to shoot with a weapon, with a gun, or with a camera. I think that's kind of irrelevant to the discussion in many ways. I mean, obviously we have our personal preferences, but I think the differences come about with how do we actually in reality, not just in the theoretical world, enforce standards and regulations? And is it possible to enforce standards and regulations? And I become disillusioned not just in hunting, because I have become disillusioned with trophy hunting, whether is actually able to do that. I've also become disillusioned with mass tourism, that we will be able to do it with that too, where every new lodge is just more income. And can you pull back that once you've started to continuously build more and more camps and put more and more people in cars into an area? So I think that's potentially one area of difference. And then the other area is, I do think it comes back to questioning some of the science around dynamics of herds and prides, and whether there is something there, and whether it's the best use of land to do hunting versus tourism in certain areas. And I think the biggest crux of the issue is this instance that set us all ablaze in Tanzania and around Amboseli. It sounds like we're sort of on the same page and we're still asking for answers here. But I mean, I think we were all a bit enraged because it's not a good example. of sustainable anything. And I think that's sort of where we have our sort of similarities and differences in many ways.
Yeah, I think the the detail that we're on the same page in, and it would be flagrant from a journalism perspective if it was false. If a helicopter was used, it's just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous, to push an animal into an area. And I agree. I think all hunters should be, looking at that, going, "What the hell are we doing?" That's not hunting at the end of the day, from an ethos of hunting. Will, last words?
I don't think so, really. I think kind of touching on that though. So say it comes out that the helicopter was used. Would you expect to see a reaction from the hunting community like there has been from the anti-hunting community on this issue? So the anti-hunting community, regardless of the means of hunting it, are just going, this is wrong, end of. Would you expect that if it turned out that a helicopter had been used and it was poor practice, would you expect there to be any kind of pushback from your hunting community, or do you think it would just be a case of people going, well, I don't really agree with that, and move on? One of the big things I wrote about in my dissertation was that occasionally the industry's biggest enemy is itself, right? If it is trophy hunting, it is the need to push for the biggest things. And then once you've hunted the trophy, you want to be able to talk about the fact that you've hunted the trophy. That is obviously going to cause backlash. And now the world we live in, it's only going to become more and more polarized, and the nuances do get lost. But would you expect the industry to regulate itself in matters like this, to go, I'm sorry, that's too far, and we as an industry want to speak up about it? Because at least that way it might attract more people to see more of the middle ground in this argument.
If the facts were true and verified that a helicopter was used, I can almost guarantee that the organization representing hunting in that specific country, like to be specific, in that specific country, would come out against that behavior.
But would anything then come of that moving forward? Would there be a case of you guys going, okay, well, look, there needs to be reform to this? Like, I do feel there is very much a kind of...
Well, I think that's number one. I think it's illegal. I don't know if it's written down or not, but again, that sort of rolls into the whole, like, then rolls into government and regulations and things like that. I would hope that if it came true, that it came to light that the thing was that was absolutely true. I would say that's unacceptable behavior. I can't speak for other organizations. Would they say that they would say something about it? I don't know. I would hope so. Not to deflect, but I can't answer for everybody else, right? But Charlie, we've talked about the ecotourism side of things. Like, if something really unethical happens in the ecotourism operator side, would the same thing happen there? Or would they be like, that's not really right, and just move on, kind of thing?
Good question. And I think that maybe they wouldn't do it on their own. But as Will stated, the backlash on that side, even for things like crowding at the Mara River in the Mara, is great. And so whether or not actions actually occur, they have been occurring. But I think that there's such a pushback against that there are sort of things put in place. I mean, because I think that, or at least there's enough of pressure to get something changed when there is something very egregious happening on an ecotourism side. Although I agree with what you're saying, more needs to be done. But I find sometimes with hunting that there's a mentality that because it seems like you guys are on the back foot, whether that's perception or reality, I don't know, that it's like, well, we can't, we're already sort of on the, we're on the defensive, so let's just not say anything about this. And that's a problem.
No, you're 100% right. Hunting is I use this analogy all the time, and it may not be PC, not PQ, PC. But like 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you were gay, you didn't let anybody know. You're in the closet, kind of thing, right? And that's why that sort of phraseology was used. But today, if you're gay, you're proud about it, and that's good. Hunting, unfortunately, has gone in the reverse. Hunting is now in a closet, and the only time you come out of the closet is when something bad happens, or something that you want to, kick. Somebody opens the closet door and punches you in the nose, and then you come kicking and screaming out the door. And then when everything quietens down, you slowly retreat back into your closet and close the door. You're absolutely right. That and hunting, from my perspective, from a Blood Origins perspective, I feel like the narrative that we should be leading, coming out of the closet and open the doors. Here we are. Here are the impacts of hunting to people, to wildlife, to communities all around the world. It's a great message. Does it work in every single community, in every single habitat? No. Does it work in a lot of places? Yes. Here's why.
Yeah, and I think on that, it's a bit like Charlie was saying. I feel too often the kind of narrative is justification based on the back of backlash, as opposed to, I mean, I know your channel is very different, and Blood Origins is very much trying to focus on the positives. And I think, sort of comparing it to the photographic industry, if I look at, say, the Mara, for instance, and you look at traffic there and what it's done to specifically like cheetah mortality rates with their cubs, it's bad. It's really not good. But there is an open dialogue about it. I think largely because there are so many of us there, it's very visible as a practice. So you can't really get away with the bad behavior. And there's enough people that care enough to shut it down and go, we've seen so-and-so doing this, or we've actually seen the pictures from the sighting. They've clearly behaved badly to get that shot. And there's a pretty quick backlash to it. So it's quite self-regulating in that respect. Now, there could be more that I'm very aware of. But what would, I think, be quite useful from a kind of a hunting perspective would be to actually see hunters, and it goes back to what we just talked about, saying, actually, in this case, these guys are wrong. And I think a lot of the time it's kind of the hunting community speaking as an entire community and going, no, we're sticking up for all of ourselves here, which I understand. But I think what would be beneficial if we're trying to get people more open to protecting these areas and kind of using any means necessary, is to be able to have that dialogue and go, actually, no, I'm sorry, these guys, if this is true, have got it really wrong. And we as a community, we don't stand by that. And actually, we want to be doing this, this, and this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a distrust. There's a distrust there, I think, between groups, and that's a problem. And, as much as we might, after having many conversations with you and having this conversation with you, trust you, how can we say we trust the people who killed these super tuskers when they have gone black? They've gone dark. They're not saying whether they used a helicopter. They're not saying what they did and where they come from. And I understand they don't want the exposure, but it's the same thing. It's not going to build trust when you do that, right? It's kind of going to make people question, wait, something untoward, something bad's happened here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right. Charlie, Will, my door's always open.
Yeah.
DM,
well,
podcast, chat to me. I really, really appreciate your time. I can appreciate when I made the request, the potential trepidation of coming on something like this and it being an absolute screaming match. And I knew it wasn't going to be that way. And I love these kinds of conversations. So very much look forward to it. Will, maybe one day I can bring my family to Amboseli and get those photographic shots. I only use a Leica with like a 25mm prime though, so I may be in trouble.
That's what I use, Robbie. I don't take
look at that. I didn't know I was a professional.
Wide angle stuff. And actually on that as well, probably a general apology to people that have sat through an hour and 20 minutes hoping for a slanging match at some point and have got to the end and gone, oh, that was actually quite calm. So to those guys that were keen for an argument, maybe we'll tee one up next time.
Maybe not.
Probably not though.
No, I appreciate you too. Thank you so much.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. We appreciate it as well.
All right, stay right there whilst we upload.